first round. Unlike other trade agreements, of course, Global Affairs will obviously acknowledge the cultural exemption in U.S. Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement is not unbound. The USMCA grants the U.S. the right to levy retaliatory measures of equivalent commercial effect in response to Canadian policies that would otherwise violate USMCA for cultural exemption. My question is, given that the government is touting $1 billion in required contributions from foreign platforms, the majority of which, of course, are U.S.-based, how do the witnesses view the risk of retaliation? And my other question is, have the witnesses heard anything from the U.S. officials in terms of concerns regarding Bill C-11? And the final question is, in your view, would this put at risk various other sectors in our Canadian economy?
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the questions. In terms of the first one, risk of a retaliation, I think the first thing we want to emphasize here is that we believe that the provisions of Bill C-11 are indeed consistent with Canada's international trade obligations, including its commitments under CUSMA. The draft legislation has been undertaken in such a way to try to avoid any kind of discriminatory differences between Canadian and foreign service suppliers. Now, I think the one thing that's also worth noting here is that this is a process that whereby we have the opportunity to work closely with U.S. officials as this process moves from a legislative phase and also through the end phase after the formation of specific regulations. So it's not unusual for us to have a dialogue with the U.S. from the working level all the way through up to, say, senior officials to ambassadors on issues of this type of orientation. And to that end, to answer your second question, indeed, there has been engagement between Canada and U.S. Officials on this matter. I'd characterize U.S. interest as more or less focused on process-oriented elements of this legislative initiative, understanding how it works through the House and then through the Senate, et cetera. But also to provide they've asked for, I think, what can be described as more of a general clarity or understanding of what is the intention of this bill, and that is certainly information that's been conveyed to U.S. officials. I think that U.S. officials naturally are looking for better understanding so that they can provide the certainty and predictability for their stakeholders in this regard, and that is the general characterization of the dialogue thus far. In terms of risk to other sectors, again, I wouldn't want to prejudge that this effort is going to lead to any kind of retaliatory outcome. Indeed, the type of retaliation that's been discussed in this overall review is something that we don't feel will necessarily come to fruition. When you look at our ability to engage with the U.S. on these matters over the last 25, 30 years, the U.S. has never invoked any kind of retaliatory response to Canada's cultural policy programs, and we don't see that Bill C-11 will necessarily lead to that either. But in the meantime, there are a number of different mitigation elements that are in play, and I can speak to those in more detail if you wish.
So I guess, Mr. Smith, last July when U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai met with our minister, Minister Ng, and expressed her concern on behalf of the United States that this law would be infringing on a number of sections of and our minister, or was that somewhat serious concerns about what the Americans see as overreach?
No, I think it's fair to say that the Americans want to make a signal that they're paying attention to this legislative initiative. I think that the context of these discussions, from what I gather, were quite amicable in this regard. I don't think the U.S. has presented any specific threat to Canada in this regard. And the reports that I've received from those conversations was that they think the U.S. did appreciate the feedback that our minister provided with respect to our ability to continue to ensure that our international trade obligations are indeed respected. This is something that we take very seriously, of course, because we also want the same kind of treatment for our stakeholders when they're operating abroad, including in the U.S. marketplace.